Should I start, Simon? Good afternoon and warmly welcome to this webinar about this book, The Profit Paradox: How Thriving Firms Threaten the Future of Work. Our guest today is therefore the author of this book, Professor Jan Eckhout. Mr. Eckhout is a research professor in economics at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And among other things, he is the current president of the European Economic Association. The setup for today is that we have 60 minutes at our disposal, and Mr. Eckhout will give a presentation for 40 minutes or so, and then we open up for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please state them short and sharply in the chat, and we will bring them up later on. Having said this, Mr. Eckhout, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation to talk about the book. Let me start by trying to explain what the profit paradox really entails, and then I'll go in much detail in terms of facts and some of the analysis that's behind it. Yeah. And to do so, let me give you the example of a meeting I had with a friend of mine, Alex, who had been a entrepreneur who had a startup in Silicon Valley. And a few years ago, I met him, and when we were meeting up in a bar, he tells me that he decided to close his startup, that it was the end of this venture. It was the second one that he had tried. And as he's kind of explaining what exactly happened, we see at that moment in the bar on the TV screens, the news that the Dow Jones had reached 30,000. And the news anchor at CNN was saying that this was great news for the economy, that the economy was very buoyant, that this was basically a healthy economy. And as the news anchor is explaining this, I see Alex, nodding his head. He says, "Not for me. I mean, I didn't feel that this was a very healthy economy." And it was not just for me. I've been around Silicon Valley for more than 15 years. I've seen many other people trying. And over that time, it's become harder and harder for startups to be successful, to survive. And, we didn't see that kind of that good news show that we see on the news. And as he's talking, also the waiter comes by and says, "I've been working in this bar for 13 years. Today, I take the wage home that I took back home exactly the same amount 13 years ago. So I haven't seen any growth in my wages. So for me, that's also not a good news show as the Dow Jones seems to predict." And this is what the profit paradox is about. It's about, on the one hand, these very high profitabilities, because ultimately, if a stock market valuation is high, it means that there's profitability to be expected from these firms. And on the other hand, we see in the rest of the economy a very different story: stagnating wages, startups that are declining or that are having difficulties. And the reason behind it is this fact that these high profits of a small number of firms, because let's not forget that the Dow Jones is only 35 firms. And even if you look at a wider measure of stock market performance, that it's a small number of firms in the entire economy, and that these small number but large and dominant firms are in that position because they face too little competition. And the lack of competition is what drives them to have high profits, but that's not a sign of, a healthy economy, quite to the contrary. And that's where we see all those kind of consequences in the market for smaller firms, for startups, in the labor market with wages. And that has kind of welfare implications economy-wide. So what I want to do now is go through some of the main arguments and start with some facts. Let me start with the fact which is related to the Dow Jones that I mentioned earlier. And here I'm going to show you a series of the Dow Jones. The Dow Jones, not the one that you usually see, it's adjusted for inflation. So it's basically a kind of a measure of the real Dow Jones. And what you see is that in the starting at the Second World War, from 1945 until 1980, the Dow Jones basically was fairly flat. And from 1980 onwards, the Dow Jones had an increase of around 6 to 7% per year. In real terms, that means, 8 or 9% in nominal terms. And that means that if you invested $1 in 1945, in 1980, you would still have $1 in real terms. If you invested that $1 in 1980, you would have had nearly $12. So you would have multiplied by 12 your investment, because of course that's the magic of compounding. If you grow at a rate of 6 or 7%, over 40 years, that becomes a large amount. Notice that, by the way, today, the Dow Jones, my series goes to the end of 22. Today, the Dow Jones is at 42,000. So that's telling us that in 1980, something has changed. And what has changed is telling us something about the profitability of firms, because as I said earlier, if you see a rise in the stock market valuations, that's because investors expect that the profits now and in the future are going to be higher. So they're willing to pay more for these firms. So it's not just the stock market valuation or the profits that kind of give us an indication of that. In the economics literature, the preferred measure of how much market power there is what we call the markup. And what is the markup? It's basically the price to cost ratio. And the cost here is not the total cost, including things like R&D and investment, or even the salaries of the management, or things like advertising. It's really the cost of producing some product. So if you sell a phone, it's going to be the labor that's involved, the chips, the plastic to build it, but not the design and not the R&D. And the market basically tells us, given your cost, how competitive is this world? And what we see is that this average markup over time has gone from around 1.25 in the late 50s, staying and hovering around 1.3 to 1.2 again in 1980, to 1.6 nearly towards the end of the series. So we see a big change in that average markup. Now, this is an average, okay? This is telling us something about what's going on average in the economy. It's important to keep in mind that there's a big difference across firms. And this, what I'm showing next, is the distribution of these markups. And what I have on the horizontal axis is basically what that markup is. If it says 1.2, you would be somewhere here, okay? Or 2, that means that basically you sell at a price that's twice the cost of producing it. And in the vertical axis, I just have how many, how many firms there are that have that markup. So it's a density. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is that density in the 1980s was much more compact, was much less unequal than it is in 2020. So you see that fat tail on the right here. You see a fat tail on the right with many more firms that have high markups than they were in the 1980s. And another way of seeing it is when we kind of look at the percentiles. What is the percentage? Well, the distribution that you saw before, if I want to have 90% below the area of that density, I would call that the 90th percentile. If I have 50% below that, the curve below that density, I would call it the median, the 50th percentile. And this percentiles tell us something about how unequal these distributions have come. And let me show you here the evolution of the percentiles. And you really want to look at the 90th percentile, which is driving everything. It's the 90th percentile that's going through the roof. Okay, that's basically becoming much more unequal. And that's what's driving this increase in this average markup. It's really driven by the largest markup firms. There's firms that have now much higher markups, something like 2.7, 2.8 at the 90th percentile, which was only 1.5 in 1980. Okay, and that's driving the increase in the average. Notice that the 50th percentile hasn't changed. So that tells us that in the middle of the distribution, nothing has changed. Okay, it's all coming from the top percentiles. Okay, it's telling us something about, it's not the same for all firms. Now, you might say this is a story about the United States. Here I have data for a set of firms globally. Well, we see that the pattern that we see in the United States that I just showed you earlier is the same if you look around the world, in Europe, in North America now, including Canada and Mexico, or Asia. Maybe Asia is a little bit slightly less pronounced, but everywhere we see that there's this increase in these average markups, and we see everywhere also this increase in the distribution, that it's driven mainly by these outlying large dominant firms. Okay, so where is this happening? The first reaction we had, and you might have too, is you say, well, this is going to happen in the tech industry, and it does very much happen in the tech industry where we see these dominant firms, but we see it in a lot of other industries as well. We see it also in, here this example, textiles. My favorite example for that is a Spanish firm that's basically the kind of conglomerate of brands like Zara, Inditex, which is a firm that has become very dominant over time too. So it is something that we see in retail, we see it in construction, we see it in tech, we see it in textiles, we see it everywhere. Okay? It's not something that's kind of concentrated only in tech. If anything, tech does play a role that in these traditional sectors, the firms that adopt this new digital technology most are going to be the ones that also are going to be the firms that acquire this dominant position. So tech plays a role. The ones who invest more in tech are the ones who acquire that dominant position, but it's not only in the tech industry. And this is something very important to keep in mind. Okay, now, one of the points that I make in the book, and it is coming from the research that I have done with a number of co-authors, is that we see this rise in dominant position in monopoly power by these firms, okay? And this has macroeconomic consequences. Why does it have macroeconomic consequences? Well, it has macroeconomic consequences because these firms are maybe small relative to the economy, but it's happening for quite a few firms. And if we add up, even though these firms are a small number in the entire economy, we think about, in the United States alone, there's about 6 million firms. Worldwide, there's probably about 100 million firms. If you look just at these dominant firms, there's maybe 400 or 500. That's a small number, but because they're in all sectors, because they're large and global firms, they actually are accounting for a large share of GDP. And we see that they account for maybe 30 or 40% of GDP. And because they're accounting for such a large share of GDP, this is going to have kind of repercussions economy-wide. Okay, and these are the macroeconomic consequences. And I kind of rank them, or I subdivide them in three categories. One is the type of consequences that we see in the labor market. I'm going to talk in particular about the decline in the labor share. Second, these are consequences that are for firms, and we call this in particular business dynamism that's declining. And third, apologies, it also has implications for inequality. It has an impact on inequality in the economy. So let me start with the labor share. What is the labor share? If you look at GDP, the total amount of output, goods and services that's being produced, how much of that, what share of that is used to compensate for labor? Okay. And since the early 20th century, by work by Bowley, Arthur Bowley, and Nicholas Calder, both economists at LSE and at Cambridge, they had figured out, looking at the data, that the share of labor is actually fairly constant, around 2/3 of GDP. Okay, 66%, you see here 65%. Now what has happened is that until the 1970s and 80s, that share was fairly constant. Since the 1980s, that share has started to decline. Okay, it fluctuates a little bit, but it's gone down to around, 59%, 60%. Okay, and you might say this is a small amount, but really this is something we had never seen. Okay, and this is telling us that something is going on. And when we look in greater detail, what is going on is that the amount that's being paid to labor is going down. The amount that's being paid to productive capital, the amount of machines, is actually also going down. What has gone up is the amount of profits. And we see a rise in the profits in the economy. It's not just the kind of the labor share that goes down, it's also the wages. And here I'm going to show you the relationship between wages, how they evolved. It's basically the growth rate of wages relative to the growth rate of productivity economy-wide. Now, these are going to be the wages, not of the entire economy. It's going to be the wages of all kind of production and service workers who account for around 85% of the working population. And what we see is that starting in the late 40s, productivity and wages were evolving at the same rate, at the same growth rate. And then in 1980, what we see is that once the wage growth slows down. In fact, we get wage stagnation while productivity continues to rise. Okay, so we have seen a rise in productivity, but wages, at least for the production and service workers, has not increased. And so that's telling us, again, that something is going on in the labor market. And how can we, again, kind of ascribe it or hark it back to the relationship with market power? Well, if market power goes up, profits goes up. Okay, and then the amount of productivity, the pie that we generate, has to be divided in a different way. So less is going to labor. We saw that the labor share is declining, and therefore also the wages are declining. And less is going to actually how much is invested in productive capital, and more goes to profits. And that's where this gap between productivity and wages is coming from. A second kind of set of consequences I mentioned earlier, it has to do with the dynamism that we see in the economy. And one measure that has been used for a long time by economists is what we call job reallocation. So if you take a firm, any individual firm, and you see within a year how many new jobs are created or how many new people are hired, how many people are let go, are fired, or are leaving, how many people are promoted, that's a measure of the dynamism in that company. And then we can look at how the average dynamism in the economy wide is evolving. And so in 1980, about 35% of all jobs were turning over in that way, basically through hiring or firing or letting go or people leaving. And that tells you, you know, how the firm is adjusting its labor force over time. What has happened to that job reallocation measure is that it has declined from 35%, okay, down to 25% today. And so that's a substantial decline in basically the fraction of jobs that are being subject to these reallocations. Okay, and that's telling us something about the dynamism. It's telling us basically something about how firms are adjusting to new situations, how firms are basically coping with a changing environment. Okay, that's going down. But it also tells us how much, as a result of this mismatch there is. What we mean by mismatch is that some workers and firms are at a lower rate moving to different jobs, and that tells us that they're going to end up in jobs that maybe not are the right jobs for what their qualifications are, and as a result, you get a loss due to that mismatch. It's not just on the job reallocation. We also see this on the fraction of startups, and this is the story I was telling earlier about my friend Alex. His story is not a story in isolation. It's something that we see much more broadly in the economy. The fraction of all firms that were startup firms, that were new firms in the late 70s was just under 14%. By the time we get to today, that fraction has gone down to about 8%. Okay, so we see a massive decline in the fraction of startups. The first thing you probably say is that, wow, this is a surprise because, you know, we live in a world of digital technology, of people starting up new firms in garages in Silicon Valley. Well, that was probably true in the 1970s, 80s, and maybe even the 90s. But since then, we've seen a decline, and a substantial decline in these startups. And that's why friend Alex was experiencing not just his firm, but also the firms around him that he saw. It's a harsher environment in the presence of these dominant firms to run a startup and to be able to be successful with those startups. And as a result, fewer people, entrepreneurs try it. And this has big implications for the economy. The type of implications that this has is that since we know that startup firms are firms that tend to hire more people, they tend to hire more young people, and they tend to innovate more compared to large firm per unit of sales. So, you know, if I would take 10 small firms that are as big as a large firm, these 10 firms together would innovate more than that one large firm that's 10 times larger than each of these individual firms. And that tells us basically that if you have fewer startups, you have less innovation. If you have fewer startups, you have fewer people being hired, so you have less of that dynamism in the economy. And this is something to worry about because it's a long-run implication for growth and for through innovation. And I think we cannot underestimate the impact that these the startup decline has. However counterintuitive it is, because, you know, if I don't show the data, people don't really believe it. Okay. And we can cut this data. This is a fairly well-documented fact, not just by myself, but by other people. If you cut the data in different ways, you get the same story each time that there's a decline in these startups. The third class of implications for the macroeconomy have to do with inequality. And what I'm going to show you here is the evolution of wages for 4 categories of workers: those with high school, those with 2 years of college, say a professional degree, those with a 4-year college degree, and those with more than 4 years of college, masters, doctors, and so on. And what we see, I first normalize all these wages to 1 to 100%, and I just want to look at how they change. And what we see over time is that these wages initially evolve at the same rate until the 1980s. And then from the 1980s onwards, they start to fan out. And we see that there's an increase in this inequality. And there's 2 things to point out about this here. First, that of course, if you're in that top category, you get very nice high wages. Okay, you get wages that have gone up substantially. This is something that has been quite well documented. But also, we see that the lower trained, lower schooled workers see actually for some period a decline in their wages. Okay, so you see between 1980 and say 2010, the wages of these people have declined by 20%. And this is something that is a cause for concern, because it tells us, well, if wages would be paid in competitive markets, and if you go to the textbook Econ 101 model, you say, you know, wages equal to the marginal product, this would tell us that these workers, the high school graduates or the dropouts, have become less productive because their wages have gone down. It must be that their marginal productivity has gone down. I think this is a hard sell for the reason that there's been productivity growth, maybe more for the high-skilled workers or for those with more schooling, but there's also been productivity growth for those who have had less schooling. And that productivity growth for those who have had less schooling should show up in higher wages if you have competitive labor markets and competitive markets. Now, we don't have those. And so it's the decline in the degree of competitiveness that again drives a wedge between the productivity of these workers and their wages. And I think that's the important insight here, that the inequality is not only driving, you know, these different classes of workers apart from each other, it's also telling us that the increase in the profitability of these firms and the lack of competition leads to them getting a smaller share of the pie than they would before. Okay. I wanted to make a distinction between the type of impact that market power has on wages through what is called monopsony. I have here a picture of Joan Robinson. She was the economist in the 30s who first came up with this notion of what monopsony is. And monopsony is kind of the flip side of monopoly. It's the same idea, but applied to the labor market. So if a firm has monopoly power, it sells its good at a higher price than it would in a competitive market. And so it can extract some of the rents from the customers. If that firm has monopsony power, think of, you know, a copper mine in an isolated mountainous region with one little town that has only one employer, which is the copper mine. Then that copper mine can exert the same type of power over the workers as the monopolist can exert over its customers. How? Because the monopsonist is going to pay lower wages because these workers have nowhere else to go. And so they'll be willing to work for that firm at a wages below their marginal product. And so that drives a wedge between the productivity of the worker and the wage. Now, you ask, it's clear that monopsony has an effect on wages. You ask, what is the effect of monopoly on wages? Well, it's actually a more indirect channel, and it's going through the demand for labor. Excuse me. If we see a rise in monopoly power, firms charge higher prices. What happens is that, you know, if there's enough firms that have monopoly power, as is the case as documented in the economy, then they basically, at these higher prices, they're basically going to be facing less demand for that same good. And so they're going to sell fewer units of it. They still want to do it because they have higher, you know, per unit gains because the price is higher. So they're willing to sell fewer units, depending on whatever the elasticity is, because they get higher profits. But this decline in excuse me, this decline in the quantity that's being demanded also means that there's a decline in the amount that's being produced. And that decline in the amount that's being produced leads to a decline in the demand for labor, because, you know, if you produce less, you need less labor to produce it. Now, so if there's a decline in the demand for labor, the monopoly effect, the indirect monopoly effect, means that there's basically a decline in the wages, because if you have a decline in labor demand, there's going to be an effect on the wages. Now, in our research, we try and disentangle the monopsony effect and the monopoly effect. And what we find is that the monopsony effect, this direct effect of dominant firms on the labor market, has about a 25% decline of the total decline in wages is 25% due to the monopsony, whereas the monopoly effect is accounted for about 75% of the decline in wages. So it's that fact that these firms are dominant in the let's make the output market, through the decline, higher prices, decline in labor demand, leads to a decline in wages of around 75% of the decline in wages that we see overall. And I think that's interesting to decompose these two sources. In terms of inequality, there's another kind of implication that we see, is that I showed you the wage stagnation for the production and service workers, but we know that a lot of the increase in the inequality, in the wage inequality, is coming from the top 1% or even the top 0.1%. So it's really happening in the top tail of the distribution of inequality, of wage inequality. And what I'm going to show you here is the evolution of markups in conjunction with manager pay. And what we see is that manager pay and markups until the 1970s, 80s was fairly flat. And then they started to increase, the two of them, fairly much in lockstep from the 1980s onwards. So we see that, you know, even though wages of production workers have stagnated, the wages of managers have gone up much more. And that's creating that inequality, which is driven by the rise of this market power, these markups that we've calculated before. Our research shows that there's a direct relationship between that kind of market power and these this compensation for managers. So I've talked quite extensively about the consequences, but let's ask the question, what are the causes? Where is this coming from? And by the way, why 1980? Everything seems to kind of take a turn in 1980. I show you a picture of a castle, and the reason why I show this is because Warren Buffett, arguably the most successful investor in history, was once asked when he gave a talk to MBA students, you know, how do you pick the firms that you invest in? And he says, in response to that question, he said, when I think of a firm, I think of a castle. Okay? And I think of a firm as a castle because I want it to be strong and valuable. I want it to have thick walls and very well kept. And I want this to be valuable in of itself. Second, I want there to be a duke or a duchess who's in charge of the castle, who basically is knowledgeable about what the castle does and need, can maintain it. And above all, third, I want this castle to have an enormous moat around it, like you see in this picture, to keep off anyone who can attack that castle. And what he has in mind with that is that he says, I don't want there to be any competitors that can get close to the castle. He even said, because he was in Florida, maybe you should throw in some alligators and some sharks to keep the competitors out. And you can easily see what he has in mind here. You won't be making profits, and therefore you won't get any return on your investment as an investor if your firm is not going to have some form of monopoly power, is not going to generate any kind of monopolistic profits, because otherwise in a competitive world, your profits are going to be driven to, well, whatever the compensation is just for the investment. Okay, so you want extra profits, you need a monopoly position. Now, what does this have to do with 1980? The first thing is, you might say, well, 1980 was kind of a change in the policy. We had Thatcher and Reagan, and I'm going to come back to that. It's accounts for something. But 1980 is also kind of the year where digital technology starts to become important economically. It did exist before, For that matter, Microsoft and Apple were founded in the 70s, and there was definitely a lot of digital technology before that. But 1980 was the year where households started to buy personal computers, firms started to use computers, mainframes, servers. This was the kind of the point at which economically this digital technology started to have an impact. And this digital technology, that transformation, that technological change, you can think of that as, you know, in the movie of The Economy, both the hero and the villain. The hero, why? Because the things we can do today with that technology is just, you know, is quite unimaginable what it would have been like 20 years ago. I mean, I always say, you know, who would have known 20 years ago that today you can hold a device in your hand and not only does it show you a map where you are, it tells you where you can go and how you can get there. Okay, I mean, that kind of technology, simple technology or trivial technology or taken for granted technology today didn't exist even 20 years ago. And so in that sense, you know, from cancer research to improving people's lives from day to day, the technology is the hero of the movie. But there's also a villain because the firms use the technology to deter entrance from competitors. And the reason is because that technology typically relies very much on scale, an enormous upfront investment in intangibles, very low marginal cost. That's the standard example, textbook example of a natural monopoly. Network externalities, if you have platforms or social networks, basically give you the same kind of returns to scale. I want to be on a social network where there's other people who are on a social network because I don't want to be on a thin network. I want to find as many people as possible. I want to be on a platform like eBay where there's a lot of sellers if I want to buy, and I want to be on a platform like eBay if there's a lot of buyers if I want to sell. So kind of density is important. That means that, you know, you want scale. And that scale gives rise to natural monopolies. And we see that that scale has existed before with railways and with oil exploration and with electricity. But today, with the digital technology, that scale is even bigger because it's now at a global level. These firms become so big that they operate at a global level. And so technological change and scale economies is really an important driver behind this kind of change in 1980, because the firms that have access to that technology, sometimes, you know, they compete a lot for the market, but once they have won that market because of the scale economies, there's no longer any competition in that market, and it allows them to extract rents. I said earlier, you know, lax competition policy with Reagan and Thatcher has contributed to that too. We find that it accounts maybe for about 15 to 20%, the main contribution coming from technological change. And then there's also globalization, of course. And I think of globalization as one form of technological change, because ultimately it's about faster transportation, about transmission of information. Of course, policy matters because we can bring down trade barriers, as has happened through the WTO, especially with the ascent of China into the WTO. But in a sense, you know, still there, policy and technology together are what's driving these big changes. This is kind of a way to think of what a firm does. And on the right-hand side, you see a representation of what supposedly Jeff Bezos had drawn on a napkin, which is telling you, basically what his business model is. And his business model is basically reduce the cost through the network, through the scale economies that a company like Amazon has with its fulfillment centers and the delivery network that they have. By reducing the cost, okay, they can actually charge lower prices. And by charging lower prices, they can get a larger market share. Now, the key thing is that they reduce the cost more, exploiting the scale economies and the network externalities. And at the same time, they reduce the prices to capture customers, but by not as much. So the price decline is less than the cost decline. Now, that's the perfect recipe for an increase in the markup, because the markup is the price over cost. So basically, you know, you become very competitive, okay, but you don't pass the gains from competition on to the customers because, you know, you're able to do that because there's not enough competition in your market. So there's a kind of, you see a tension between my words, competitive and competition. what a business person calls being competitive is the opposite of having competition, because they say, I'm competitive, I'm very different from my competitors, and I therefore have some form of monopoly power. Firms use innovation heavily to deter entry, okay? And so basically, this is kind of what I mentioned earlier. You create a winner-take-all kind of setting, and I think we're going to see much more of that in the years to come. You know, massive data and the use of artificial intelligence is, you know, winner-take-all style markets, because you need enormous upfront investment, also in energy, but also in infrastructure, to be able to run many of these artificial intelligence models. You're going to get huge profits because very few competitors can actually make that enormous investment. So it's a race to become the winner. So there's a lot of competition for the market, as I said earlier, but very little competition in the market once that is established. And innovation is basically a kind of an entry deterrent. If you think about, you know, what competition is, it's a form of leveling the playing field. If you think, or you consider what many of these firms are doing, with the tech firms, but also the non-tech firms that are using the technology, you see them being operational in a market that's very uneven. It's like watching a football game where 15 play against 7 instead of 11 against 11. The field is tilted where the 15 players are on the top side and the 7 players on the bottom side. And maybe even the goals are smaller for the 15-player team on the top and larger for the 7-player team at the bottom. And on top of that, you might have a referee who's kind of biased because the referee is from the dominant side. I mean, you don't see much competition there, just like, you know, bullies winning that game by nearly trivially having all that power. And in a sense, when you think about what's going on in many of these markets, that there's really truly an unlevel playing field, that there's no kind of a proper competition that's being allowed because of these returns to scale that I mentioned, because of these scale economies and network externalities that lead to this uneven and unlevel playing field. What can we do in terms of policy? Well, in terms of policy, the first thing we can think of is taxes, and I think taxes can help redistribute. If you see this accumulation of profits, it's probably easier for a government then to tax the profits than to tax the labor income, which is in a way very, you know, is very costly to tax, because this is going to have an effect on the workers who might drop out of the labor force or who might work less hours as a result. So it may be a way to redistribute from profits towards workers through the taxation, but it's not going to solve the problem that's at the core of why we have this dominant position, okay? And so in a sense, the only thing that we really can do is try and create more competition. And I think a crucial kind of concept here is what we call interoperability. Interoperability comes from the fact that, as you see on the slide, these plugs should be working for different devices. And there's now regulation in the EU and also in the US that, you know, plugs should be interoperable, i.e. should work for different devices, and there's standards that are set for that. But this interoperability is much more broad than that. One example of interoperability is that in the telecom industry in Europe in the late 90s, the European Commission and the regulators, they decided that in an attempt to integrate the telecom markets between different countries, because they had a kind of an objective of integrating the economies of the different countries, they required that telecom operators who own, say, a network of cell towers were forced to accept competitors on their towers. Okay, excuse me. The regulator did set a price for this usage, for this rental. Of course, the operators didn't like it, because once you have competitors in your towers, they're going to try and get your customers, and they're going to lower the price to get access to your customers. But this is a form of interoperability, because it's saying you have a network and you have to make this network open to competitors. That is, you have on the one hand a network, like you have a rail network of for the train traffic, but you allow different operators on this network. So the competitors could be in the rail traffic, could be basically the different companies that vie for the services of the customers. But at the same time, in the telecom example, you have your network, you have to open it, which is it's very expensive to set up this network of cell towers. You have to open it to other companies that can basically compete for the same customers. And that type of interoperability is a proven recipe to lower prices and lower profits, and therefore induce competition between these firms. If you compare my phone plan in the United States, when I'm in the United States, it costs about 2.5 times what my plan cost in Europe, because the United States does not have this type of interoperability requirement in telecom. And because it does not have it, the result is that there's much less competition. There's only 3 big firms. Prices are, as I said, higher, but also the service is worse. And basically, there's no interest, of course, by these telecom operators to accept interoperability. It has to be imposed by the regulator. And we see in Europe lower prices, and we see hundreds of competing operators, which is basically ultimately in the benefit or to the benefit of the customer. We should treat digital firms also as utilities as in, companies that provide electricity, water, and other services, transportation, because utilities are, in a sense, industries that are monopolistic and that are therefore regulated. We also need more resources. It's extremely hard to maintain kind of that competitiveness within these markets, implementing interoperability, treating them as utilities, because you need the regulator to be able to actually step in. It's not enough to have the legislation. You also need the kind of the policing power to enforce these policies and this regulation. And that's often something that these firms face. Okay. It's a global problem. We see that many of these firms are global. It requires a global solutions. Very often people argue, we need less globalization. Globalization is the cause of all this. We cannot dial back globalization. We cannot stop the fact that people are using Google everywhere. They're using iPhone and Android phones globally, that there's an integration of this technology, that this technology is spreading worldwide. We cannot stop that. However, even if we wanted to, we cannot do that. So the problem has become a global problem. The scale has become global. Rather than saying we need less globalization, we need more globalization also at the regulation stage. And so in a sense, we need more globalization rather than less. And we have to think also where the customer is. I think that's important. Sometimes people say, oh, this is a problem for the United States, but ultimately it doesn't matter where these firms are. What matters is where the customer is, and to achieve the kind of the competition that customers deserve, we will need global institutions. We know that they exist for patents. There are global institutions for patents. There's attempts to do coordinated tax policy. I think we also need now a global institutions with coordinated policy on competition and pro-competition policies. Of course, there is a vicious circle between market power and political power, right? Because if you have market power, you create profits. These profits allow you to lobby the government to influence the political power. This gives you favorable regulation. You get more market power, because the favorable regulation basically doesn't implement, for example, the interoperability, as is the case in the telecom market in the United States. These firms use their lobbying to keep out interoperability. And you have this vicious circle, which is very hard to break, and is, I think, one of the main reasons why we face the type of political stalemate very often that we see in trying to implement pro-competitive policies. Okay, last point I want to make. You might say, well, can it get worse? First of all, how bad is it at the moment? We calculate, and not just we have other people who have done very similar calculations. About 8% of GDP is lost due to market power, okay, compared to what we would have had if we had competition of the level of 1980. So basically 8% of GDP is just lost, okay? Where is it lost? Well, it's lost in the fact that there's more rent extraction, that there's not enough devices sold because the prices are too high, because these wages are too low, and this causes distortions in the economy. And that type of distortion is worth 8% of GDP. Just to give you a kind of a reference point, the cost of 10% inflation is about 0.5% of GDP. Okay, we definitely dislike inflation. It causes distortions, but the distortion of inflation is substantially lower than the distortion of market power. Okay, it's of an order of 16 times as big. So it's something that we definitely have to take seriously. So inaction is not an option. You know, we've seen in the kind of the 1900s that when there was these monopolies that were rising because electricity, transportation, some forms of communication with telegraph and telephone, when this led to these monopolies, that this also created distortions in the economy. For however much attempts there were to break down this trust, it didn't really work very well, and they were only broken down after 2 wars and one Great Depression. And I think we can do better than that today because we understand much better what exactly is going on to stop that. So I hope that, you know, we'll see it can get much further. We can get, you know, consolidation of the tech firms. We have 5 big tech firms, you know, who knows, it's going to be 4 at some point, 3, 2, or even 1. This is going to lead to much more market power and dominance. And this is going to have all of these negative consequences that we talked about. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Eckert, for this very clear presentation. I have a list of questions here, and hopefully some people will send in some questions through the chat. But I bring on some short and sharp questions from the beginning here, Mr. Eckert. And the first is, can you just explain for the viewers, can it be the case that the increased markups is caused by more costs not included in the markup definition, like intangibles and so forth?
And the short answer is that's part of the story. And that's why I didn't show you the series, that we also look at other measures like profitability.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we definitely see in the data is that intangible expenditure is going up. And as you say, that's not part of the calculation of the markup. No. But it's also part of the story because it's also part of the barriers to entry. And what we see is that, you know, typically firms invest more in intangibles and they get lower cost of production. That's the trade-off. Okay, you invest more upfront and then you produce cheaper. Digital technology is exactly that. More upfront cost, lower production. So, you know, those higher upfront costs also mean lower marginal costs and higher markups. In any event, what we do is we look at those firms that have the highest intangibles. There's also the ones that have the highest markups and have the highest profit rates, both of them. And so we see that the rise in the intangibles is not compensated just in terms of the rise in markup. The markup is going up much more, and that's why the profits go up. So we look at profits as an important measure to take into account that.
Okay, thanks. Another question, more technical maybe. If we have this broad set of market power in the Western world, what does it matter for the productivity measure? Is it more difficult to measure productivity when you have markups, or what's going on there?
It's a great point, and there's a bit of a big debate within the academic literature. It's clear that productivity is something we don't see. And so it's usually a residual, you know.
Total factor productivity here.
It's a residual of what else we can put in there. Now, since it's a residual, and since it basically needs a conceptual framework, it's specific to what your framework is. And typically we have measured, and we still measure mostly productivity using only competitive markets, assuming markets are competitive.
Yes.
If you assume markets are not competitive, that's going to give you a different measurement. Okay. What the debate in economics is about, or the academic economics is about, is how exactly to do it.
Yeah. How to do it?
Well, I don't know. I don't have the short answer, because even there it depends exactly on what kind of view of market power there is. What is the source of the market power?
Yeah.
What I do know is that 2 things matter. One is not just kind of the aggregate productivity, but also how productivity is distributed across firms.
Yes.
Very important. And we see one of the things that we see is when we measure productivity, taking into account market power, we see that these productivity kind of differences have become bigger. Before, say in the 80s, firms looked more similar to each other in terms of productivity.
Yes.
That has increased. And now productivity differences by themselves are a cause of market power, because the more different you are, you can basically behave. If one firm, say Amazon, is so much more productive than a competitive firm, they can behave like a monopolist, even if they're not a monopolist. And the reason is because these other firms are so little productive that they actually can dominate them in that sense. So I think, give us a few years, we're working on it, but I don't really have the final answer on that one.
Okay. You also mentioned Leontief in your book, this input-output structure. I mean, of course, if you have market power, just not in your sector, you can also affect upstream and downstream. Your measures you're referring to here, are they included so you can see the distortional effects through the production chain?
I mean, there is more and more work. The constraint there is good data to have kind of the full kind of input-output linkages. There's increasingly work on this using both input and output kind of market power, because I can have market power on what I sell, but I can also have market power on what I buy.
Exactly.
The example I gave you before on monopsony is kind of what I buy as labor, but it can also be what I buy as intermediate inputs. Sure. And there's more and more work with better and better data, by the way, trying to get that properly measured. Again, it's the constraints is not so much the conceptual way of doing it. We know how to do it, is to have good data. Okay. Because you really need very detailed data, not just on who trades with who in terms of the firms, but also in terms of the transactions, prices, and quantities. Exactly. And that's typically don't have the right information to calculate it.
But I think Belgium has unique data on this.
That's right. And so, in fact, I'm now starting to get access to the Belgian data precisely to do that.
Okay. Okay, then I have a question on the policy side. When you talk about interoperability as the main solution, and I have two questions here. The first is that, as you said, that the markup increase is really spread out in the economy in all sectors. In what sense can interoperability be a solution in every sector? It's more like in the digital sectors where you can find that type of solution. And the second question related to this is that in Sweden, we have the railway system, and I have, in UK and France, the interoperability doesn't work that fine, actually. So is it the possibility of having this as a solution is limited by both the total markets, all markets, but also when you have this possibility, it doesn't work in practice?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to it. I'm very sympathetic to the fact that one, it's difficult and even impossible to do. So where we see, that it can work, if it's badly implemented, it doesn't work. And let me give you the example of Railtrack in the United Kingdom and what's going on now with the fast trains in Spain, the line Barcelona-Madrid. Okay, the fast kind of trains are now operated. There's one track system which is owned by the government-owned railway company in Spain. And then the French, Italian, German, and Spanish companies operate on that track. We see that it works very well. It's been operative for about 2 years. Prices have dropped massively. There's a big increase in the usage. And so you separate here the network from the operation. That's kind of the textbook example of interoperability. Railtrack was a disaster. Railtrack was badly funded, had the wrong incentives, and in the end ended up having accidents where people died because there was no investment in the track system. And when you separate the two, of course, the regulator has to be very careful to set the transfer pricing right and the regulated prices right, such that there's the right incentives to keep innovating. And so I think it's very similar settings where the implementation is completely different. So the first thing is, even if it works, you still have to be very careful as a regulator to properly implement it. The second thing is, if you ask me, can we apply interoperability to, say, Amazon or Inditex? Maybe Amazon, it can still work because they have their platform and we can regulate, preferential treatment of their own products. We can regulate that. We can maybe, have transfer pricing, as in how much the external users who are selling on Amazon's platform, they have to pay, not Amazon who charges the price. So maybe there's a way to do it. It's going to be a lot harder with a company like Inditex, whose network is a network of shops.
How do you do it?
How do you do it? And I think that there, it's unlike the railway example where it's badly implemented. I think it may not be possible to implement it in this setting. And then I think we have to, one, keep thinking about it, how to introduce kind of competitive forces, and two, keep doing kind of, analysis on it and see how can we influence it. I don't think that there's no solution. Maybe we also have to settle for a second best solution, not the first best solution. But it's probably going to be better than not doing anything at all.
Okay, thanks. Then I go to the issue more broader. You talk about both monopoly and monopsony. When it comes to the monopsony aspect, do you have any solutions there to make the labor market more competitive and reduce the difference between the productivity and the wage?
I think it's very hard. One thing we see in the data, I mean, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that monopsony power is substantial. It's about 35%, maybe 40%. So the wages are 35 to 40% lower than the productivity. The good news is, so that's the bad news. The good news is that it hasn't changed much over time. Okay, so it hasn't gone up as much as the kind of the output market power has gone up. Now, what to do about it? I think there's a lot of kind of things that we can do with these non-compete clauses that have become illegal in some jurisdictions. So I think there's work to be done there, but still, even if we would eliminate non-competes and things like that, it wouldn't solve the entire problem. And I think it's quite challenging what to do. We know that minimum wages can have some effect, but we have to be careful, because if they become too big,
sure,
they have adverse effects.
Yes.
Okay. And so in that sense, again, I'm a proponent of the type of regulation that is very kind of close on the ball, to look very carefully about what kind of effect regulation has. Just like something that, the Scandinavians do in say, active labor market policy. There's a lot of kind of experimenting going on. Yeah. I think with regulation of monopsony power, you have to do the same thing.
Yeah. In Norway, they've had the recent research on monopsony, where they see that when you have collective agreements and where you have strong trade unions in the firms, they reduce the monopsony power of the firm. So there are actually studies coming out now with kind of the same social model as we have in Sweden. So maybe that's a tool in the future.
Definitely, yes. I think that's promising.
Yeah. Then two more questions before we close. 2 minutes. You mentioned Schumpeter. Can you just say a few words about why Schumpeter was wrong?
I don't think Schumpeter was wrong. I mean, there's one thing that is underestimated about Schumpeter's kind of contribution, which is that Schumpeter said we have to give some monopoly rents to firms to innovate, but he said those monopoly rents have to be temporary.
Yeah,
they should not be permanent. If you look at, say, the rents that a Facebook or a Google have had for now 30 years, this is not what Schumpeter had in mind, incentives to set up Facebook or Google. So, Zuckerberg would have set up his company if he would have known that for sure he would not make more than 2 million out of. Now, the company has made 300 billion or, whatever it has made for him. And that's coming from the fact that this prolonged 30-year monopoly power is something different. He competed for the market, he won that, and he was compensated for that. But then, he never faced any competition in the market and was able to extract the rents. And I think that's the problem. And Schumpeter would have never considered that kind of rents as necessary to have the innovation.
No, that's a temporary payoff you have to innovate in the first place.
Exactly.
Perfect. And the last question is, you do the distinction between pro-business and pro-market as kind of sum up the problem. Can you just say a sentence on that distinction?
I mean, there's, ultimately market power is about distribution and redistribution. And the people, if you hear people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Andreessen, who say we need this monopoly power, they're at the same time saying, we want more and I want you to have less. Mm. And as an economist, we know that, this redistribution not only kind of changes how the pie is cut, it also changes the size of the pie. Sure. And so competition makes the pie the biggest as possible. Okay. It does mean that, those who own these businesses, these dominant businesses, are going to get a smaller slice than if this pie is smaller. So it's kind of contradictory, right? With a smaller pie, they get a bigger slice. Now the pie is bigger and they get a smaller slice. Mm. But of course, the rest of the economy gets a bigger slice together. And ultimately, it's distributive. It's data about distribution. So the pro-business people say, I want larger slices, whereas the pro-market, the pro-competitive argument is let's maximize the size of the pie. Mm. And that's really, I think, what it's about.
Oh. I think that is a very nice closing words. And many, many thanks for you taking your time this hour discussing this with us. And hopefully we will read more about you in the future.
It was my great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye for today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.